Welcome back to part 2 of my video on non-financial performance measurement of corporate activities. As you can see on the screen, part 1 of this video ended with an overview of the yet incomplete pyramid system of non-financial key performance indicators. I put the focus on 3 core building blocks of such a system: greenhouse gas emissions, the share of renewable energies in total energy consumption, and finally water usage and waste management. For the rest of this video, I will concentrate on greenhouse gas emissions measured in kilotons of CO2 equivalents and the resulting effects of their measurement and pricing on corporate decision making. The actual legislation on the measurement and valuation of CO2 emissions divides them into 3 categories that are named Scope 1, 2 and 3. Scope 1 covers the direct greenhouse gas emissions from the own sources of a company. Scope 2 covers the indirect greenhouse gas emissions from purchased energies such as electricity, steam, heat and cooling, and Scope 3 includes all other indirect greenhouse gas emissions in the complete value chain, upstream from the raw materials and downstream to the end consumer and, if not recycled, to the waste deposit. For many industrial companies, these Scope 3 emissions count for 70 to almost 90% of their total emissions. From the viewpoint of a practical measurement, this is very unfavorable, because you need a lot of information from various third parties, and at least until today, you cannot guarantee that this information is always of sufficient accuracy. In the actual corporate sustainability reports, you only find statistics on the company's absolute amounts of greenhouse gas emissions in 2018 and 19, and a statement of the planned decrease until 2025 or 2030 or 2050. As an example, here are charts with the reported data on greenhouse gas emissions and on total energy consumption from BASF, Bayer, Evonik, Volkswagen, BMW and SAP. You will find download links to these charts and tables in the comment below. All my calculations were made on the basis of publicly available information. Only a few companies report emission data for earlier years in 2018, and some companies leave out the Scope 3 emissions and justify this, as mentioned above, by incomplete or doubtful data from suppliers and other third parties. The very high Scope 3 emissions of car manufacturers can be explained by the inclusion of the emissions during the use of the cars after being sold to end customers. And it is assumed in the figures here that each car of Volkswagen and BMW will be in use for 150,000 kilometers on average. It is crystal clear that nobody can be happy with such reports. Obviously, even comparable companies in the same industry seem to calculate their emissions and even their energy consumption differently. The data of BASF and Evonik, for example, differ in such a way that cannot be explained at all by their different company size. And the same is true for Volkswagen and BMW. And it looks also strange that the large pharmaceutical and chemical group Bayer, now including Monsanto, should have less emissions than the much smaller Evonik group. By the way, all these data have been approved by auditors from the Big Four audit firms. A very interesting approach to make the effects of greenhouse gas emissions more transparent than just reporting kilotons is the concept of the ecological footprint, where these emissions are converted into the usage of so-called global hectares. This usage is then compared to the available biocapacity. The well-known result on a global level is that mankind is actually using 1.7 times the biocapacity of our planet. However, I will follow a different and more cost accounting oriented approach here. As soon as we add a price tag to the kilotons of CO2 equivalents, they will turn into a critical cost element. And this connection of non-financial and financial viewpoints could be, in my opinion, the key for a more sustainable orientation of companies in market-oriented economies. Therefore, the first step in this direction, I want to propose a more or less new KPI, key performance indicator, that links non-financial to financial aspects. I call it the Greenhouse Gas Emission Cost Ratio, GGEC ratio, which expresses the greenhouse gas emission costs, valued at market prices, as a percentage of the total operating expenses. The total operating expenses are defined as the difference between operating revenue and operating income before interest and tax. The next two charts for this GGEC ratio show the increase of total operating expenses in our example companies if all their CO2 emissions would be valued at the very moderate price of €25 per ton of CO2 equivalent. This price shall be applied by the EU next year, but possibly due to expectable political compromises, some emissions might still be excluded for some years. At this moderate CO2 price, the increase in operating expenses will be rather moderate too, even if the full Scope 3 is included. For many companies, this effect should not exceed the yearly wage and salary increases or most of the raw material price fluctuations that they are used to. As in the past, it should be more or less possible to pass such moderate cost increases on to the end customers, so most companies might leave their production processes and their emissions unchanged. This means, however, that with a low CO2 price, the political goals will be missed completely. However, the government sector will still earn a nice amount on selling emission certificates or collecting CO2 taxes, and will hopefully use these proceeds for sustainable public or private investments. The picture will be totally different at a CO2 price of €55 per ton, actually foreseen by the EU for 2025. Total operating expenses would increase up to 13%, 13% for the example companies. And after some further calculations I made, I am quite sure that this will be the case also for most of their competitors in the chemical industry, for car manufacturers, and for other energy-intensive industries. In a normal competitive environment, it will be very difficult to pass these massive cost increases on to the end customers. At such a higher CO2 price, the political goals seem to be fulfilled at first sight. Companies will be forced to change or end emission-intensive processes. That's easy if you can. But if you can't, for technical reasons, your company will become unprofitable, non-competitive, and may be forced to go out of business. On the other hand, new or existing companies with a more sustainable product portfolio will become attractive to investors and thus will emerge and grow their business. This might be enhanced by government subsidies, but only if the emission certificate earnings or the CO2 taxes would be used wisely and not just being thrown into the big black hole of public debt. In the end, it is very difficult to forecast if it will be a success to turn greenhouse gas emissions into a cost element. But if you share my view that market mechanisms will be more effective than political interventions or taxes, then you should generally support any reasonable and fair system of emission certificate trading. This is the end of this video. I'm fully aware that within the time frame that I have set myself for this video, I could only cover some important aspects of this complex area of the non-financial dimensions of corporate activities. Thank you for now, and if you would be interested in further information on this topic, please let me know in your comments.